Hey guys, good morning. Welcome back to Chapel. Last week we talked about Asaph. We talked about his desire to serve God and honor God, and how his heart was in the right place to restore order and worship to not only his life, but in the church and the lives of people around him. This week we're going to talk about another lesser known hero, and I want you to just kind of stop and think for a second. You know, there are people in our lives that make a huge impact on who we are. Maybe it's your parents, it's a fourth grade teacher, next door neighbor, a coach, it's a friend. We all have people in our lives that invest time and energy, and they pour into us, and it shapes, who we are today. So if you stop and just think for a second, who are some people in your life who have invested themselves to help you become who you are now or who you are becoming? We watched that quick little video of Nick Saban being interviewed, and he talks about his relationship with Bill Belichick. Now, I'm not a Bill Belichick fan. Everybody knows that. I think he's pure evil. But when it comes to his football abilities and knowledge and what he's done, you can't help but think, man, this is amazing. Bill Belichick, he has a coaching tree that has deep, deep roots. And during Belichick's long tenure as an NFL coach, 17 assistant coaches have gone on to become head coaches in both the college game and the NFL. And even these coaches have offshoots and branches that go out. Over 100 total coordinators or coaches have come from Bill Belichick's coaching tree. At one point, 13 head coaches in the NFL coached under Belichick. How many of you have someone who's made a huge impact on your life? What was it about them that made that impact? Were they people you knew? Were they strangers? Were they just acquaintances? You see, after Jesus rose from the dead, he told his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations. And this is what he said in a nutshell. He said, what I did with you, go and do for everyone else. How I invested in you, how I have been in your life, how I've served you, serve others. How I've sacrificed for you, sacrifice for others. And by the way, I'm going to give you the power to do this. We're all called as Christians to invest our lives into others. And God has given us wisdom. He's given us knowledge. He's given us gifts. All of this to help spread the message of the gospel. Not to be hidden in our lives, but to be given out to other people. Say hi. Hi. Today's hero doesn't get a lot of press, and some of you might not even know his name. But he invested into the lives of two men who went on to do incredible things for God. Today we're talking about Barnabas, and Barnabas first comes on the scene when he sells his house and gives all of the proceeds to the apostles. His life showed his true love of people and his desire to make disciples like Christ had said. Today we're going to see a couple ideas on how to invest in other people's lives. In Acts chapter 9, Luke tells us about Saul's conversion. We know him as Paul. And so Saul was a Pharisee. He had a very prominent role in attacking the early church. And after his face-to-face encounter with Jesus, his whole life changed. Part of the problem now is he was having a difficult time in his early ministry because people were still scared of him. They didn't trust him. And this is when Barnabas steps in. In Acts chapter 9 verse 27, it says, Then Barnabas brought him to the apostles and told them how Saul had seen the Lord on the way to Damascus, and how the Lord had spoken to Saul. And he also told them that Saul had preached boldly in the name of Jesus in Damascus. He witnessed a change. Barnabas saw past the exterior. He saw past the history of Saul, and he saw this new creation, Paul. He saw what God had done to him. And now Saul, who had become Paul, had a desire to serve and do what God had called him to do. Later, there was another situation when Barnabas had been teaching in Antioch. And Antioch was home of one of the biggest happening churches during the time. The church is growing and amazing things are happening. And Barnabas decided to leave and go get Paul. But why? Acts chapter 11 tells us that Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Paul. And when he found him, he brought him back to Antioch, and they both stayed there together for a full year, teaching large crowds. Not only did Barnabas see past Paul's exterior, he saw past his history, he also saw the true potential and partnered with him in doing life and ministry together. One of the most powerful things that we can do after looking past someone's exterior and mistakes is to partner with them together and bring them along for this discipleship journey. Paul and Barnabas would later leave together as missionaries and move through parts of the known world, planting churches and seeing people become believers and true followers of Christ. Paul would go on to become a fixture in early churches as a missionary everywhere he went. We're still impacted today by the impact that Barnabas had on Paul's life. And there's another person that Barnabas invested in as well. Acts chapter 12 verse 25 said that when they had finished up their work together in Jerusalem, they returned, taking John Mark with them. Now, Barnabas was investing in another discipleship relationship, and Paul was also involved in this relationship as well. And for a small time, they were serving together and ministering together and working together. You know, one thing that we can take away from this is we should always be on the lookout for lives to invest in. And as we invest into these lives, we should bring them along the journey as well. Bring them with us. Worship together, minister together, serve together. But it seems like this was like a perfect match for these guys. Three men who had a desire to serve God, love God, and be missionaries, but there was one little problem. Later in Acts, we find out that Mark had abandoned the group. He went back to Jerusalem. We don't know why. It could have been too much for him to handle. Maybe he was homesick. Maybe he was discouraged. It doesn't really tell us why, but what we see is sometimes we invest in other people's lives and maybe it just doesn't seem to work out. And just like any good plan, you have to have a backup plan. And this is another aspect of how we invest into people's lives. Sometimes our expectations are not met. Sometimes there's disappointment. Sometimes we want to give up. Barnabas did his best to restore and fix what is broken. And somewhere along the line, Barnabas and Mark sorted things out. And Barnabas now believed that Mark was ready. And Barnabas, this is something he's teaching us to always look for ways to reconcile. And this impacts the relationship between Paul and Barnabas because later they get in a fight over whether to bring Mark on another mission trip. Barnabas wants to give Mark another chance and Paul does not want to. He doesn't want to have the same thing happen. He's going to abandon us again. This is all going to happen again. So they decide to split and they go their different ways. In Acts chapter 15, it tells us that the group breaks up. Paul heads one way, Barnabas and Mark head another. And once again, Barnabas is seeing past Mark's exterior. He's seeing past his history. He's seeing the potential in him, and he's investing his time and energy to this relationship with Mark. Paul was now established. He was strong in his faith. He was strong in his walk. And now he's turning his focus towards Mark. And it pays off because we learn later that as a result of Barnabas pouring into Mark, Paul later told Timothy, hey, bring Mark with you. Mark is beneficial to me. He's good for the ministry. You see, Barnabas, he didn't give up on Mark. Mark not only went on to work with Paul later, but he's also considered the author of the Gospel of Mark. Can it get any better? So what does it mean for us? Well, now it's our turn. It's our turn to take this idea of investing into the lives of others and doing it. In 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 2 it says, you have heard me teach things. This is what Paul says. You have heard me teach things. And he's telling us to Timothy that have been confirmed by many reliable witnesses. Teach these truths to other trustworthy people who will be able to pass them on to others. In this verse, there are 4 generations of potential disciple makers here, just like that coaching tree. Paul says the things you heard me say to Timothy, the things you heard me say, teach them to other people. Teach them to reliable men and trust those things that I've taught you with them, and then they will be able to go and tell others. So discipleship and investing into the lives of others is a process that builds and builds and builds, and it spreads just like that NFL coaching tree. Paul is telling Timothy, take these things, take what you've learned, take what you've seen me do. It's the same thing that Christ told his disciples. Go, invest in the lives of others, just as Barnabas did with Paul and Mark, Paul did with Timothy. You know, maybe you're thinking, I don't really have the ability to do this. Remember, Barnabas wasn't necessarily anyone special. I don't mean that in a bad way. Just the Bible only really tells us that Barnabas was a good man. He was full of the Holy Spirit, and he was strong in faith. He was also willing to be used and invest in these relationships. You know, to be like Barnabas, you have to love God. You have to love people. You have to want to bring his message to the world. And you have to be willing to invest in the lives of other people. Investing in the lives of others is essential to healthy spiritual life. You have people that you're pouring into, people that are pouring into you, and we should follow his example and the example of both Barnabas and Paul, and later on Mark and Timothy, to let God work in our lives and invest in the lives of others. I thank you guys for joining me today, and I hope this video finds you well. And just remember, the Great Commission, Matthew chapter 28. It's our job, it's our reason for existence to reach the world, to make disciples, to invest in the lives of those around us. And Barnabas chose to live a fruitful life for God. He saw something in Paul, he saw something in Mark, he looked past their mistakes, he looked past their exterior, and he chose to give himself to them, helping them become great men of God that we know them as today. So how different do you think the world would have been if Barnabas had just ignored Paul in Jerusalem? How about if he had just given up on Mark and left him in Jerusalem and never came back to encourage him and restore him? We may never know for sure, but we should all be glad that Barnabas took the time to invest into their lives. Listen, I want you to be praying this week about who you can invest in, and be open to others that want to invest in you. Be safe, everyone. We'll see you again next week.